Information, cyber wars, AI, and disinformation. Each one of those topics, we can talk about each one of them for hours, but we're trying to combine them here with these outstanding representatives from all over the place and try to find some sort of common theme to draw down or drill down to a specific topic. And I think that one specific theme is how the authoritarians today are using technology that for the most part the West has created against us, against the West. So that would be the overarching theme of this conversation, and we'll go into details. And please do prepare to ask questions. I think you will have very interesting responses from our panelists. And just to very briefly introduce Gustaf Göthberg is a member of the Swedish Parliament. Scott Carpenter represents Jigsaw. Mr. Steve Capus is the CEO and President and the CEO of RFERL. And Shota Gvineria represents the lovely EPRC. So let's get started, and let's start from you, Steve, to give us an overview of, not specifically from the RFE perspective, but you in this large media hat. How do you see this problem that I just described? How are the authoritarians using technology against us? It's a very broad question. You can take it wherever you want.
Well, it's why we exist, right? I mean, I've been touched by so many people at this conference have come up to me and they've said, you know, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, I sat with my grandmother and listened to your programs. It was a lifeline. And my response to that is I always get chills when somebody tells me that sort of personal story. But then I also say that our mission now is as vital as it's ever been. And that's a strong statement given our long 70-plus year history. The challenges are immense, and there's technology that is thrown against us, but there's also legislative actions that are taken. Depending on where you're talking about, our people, independent journalists get labeled as enemies of the state, extremists, political activists, foreign agents, and I'm here to tell you none of it's true. And so our organization is a journalistic organization. We're not out in the streets calling for change. That's not our role. But what we have as a very strong tool, a very effective tool, is we are purveyors of the truth. And it is clearly a threat to people like the Russian leader, to any number of different dictators, autocrats. You know, they view what we do as a threat, and therefore they use every means at their disposal. They block our sites, they harass our people, they imprison our journalists. And I will say now, we just had really welcome news that one of our journalists who was imprisoned in Russia came home after 10 months behind bars. She came home just a few weeks ago. Also Meurmishvili, and we're thrilled to welcome her back to Prague. But we still have 3 journalists who, as we speak, are in prison simply because they are journalists. And so 2 are being held right now in Belarus and 1 in Russian-controlled Crimea. It's time to bring them home. But this underscores the lengths at which people will go to silence voices of the truth, political opponents. The good news is, it's impossible to silence all opposition, all dissenting viewpoints, all religions. Our organization is based around the support of those fundamental freedoms. And where they're threatened, we go in. We have got to go in with a dedication because it's very tough work. We're having some success these days, and we can't give up.
Steve, I'll just follow up just very briefly before I move to Shota to talk about Georgia specifically. But you mentioned the skill or the profession of journalism. They cannot silence all truth. From your perspective, do people, large, populace societies, do they still trust journalists in this age of technological development, social media, etc.?
Well, it's a broad question, but I would say that at the core of it is reputational issues matter. If we lose that trust, if we lose the relevance, if we choose stories that are not important to the huge numbers of audiences, and this is a good time to remind everybody, we operate in 23 different countries, 27 different languages. We're all across Eastern Europe, into the Caucasus. We reach down into Central Asia and all the way into Iran. And those audiences turn to us.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you a good example. Our base audience inside Russia, we are still reaching people effectively inside Russia. It's not easy, but it still happens. We've seen this year, during when Navalny met his death at the hands of his Russian jailers, and when the Ukrainians launched the incursion into Kursk, we saw huge spikes of audience activity engaging with our content inside Russia. Mm-hmm. And that says to me that, yes, they still think that we have a relevance and that we can still provide something that is different from the state-sponsored propaganda that they're spoon-fed every day.
Yeah. So there is need for truthful information.
There is absolutely a need.
Shota, let's come to you now and talk about, as I call it, ground zero for this purposes. How do you view the disinformation manipulation of information manipulation from the Georgian perspective? What's happening here?
Well, yeah, I think first we have to start from a little bit bigger picture and acknowledge the fact that disinformation and information manipulation is just one tool within the broader hybrid warfare strategy. And if you look at Georgia, Georgia is the most unfortunate, I would say, and successful case of how one can lose hybrid warfare. And what Russia utterly failed to achieve in Ukraine through weapons and missiles and military instrument of power, it successfully achieved or is achieving here in Georgia. So that's a textbook case study, and that's what I teach at some of the PME institutions now, how hybrid warfare pattern of the Russian Federation works. And that's very consistent, by the way, that's not new. So there was active measures. By the way, if you have not done so, please Google Yuri Bezmenov. Yuri Bezmenov is a KGB defector. He defected from Soviet Union to Canada, and he revealed the patterns of how KGB is actually implementing the active measures strategy in different Western countries. And he had 4 stages there: demoralization, destabilization, crisis, and then normalization. If you look how Russia's hybrid warfare actually came about through this changed pattern of active measures, you see the same 4 stages. You see how Russia creates a problem, then invites everybody to negotiate that problem around the table and escalates at the same time. So everybody is scared, you know, of this Third World War or the nuclear exchange or escalation, generally speaking. Then Russia gains some sorts of concessions, and then it digests that concession and repeats it in different point in time, different geography. And this is how Russia has been extending its influences in what it calls its near abroad, or the sphere of exclusive influence. And the sphere of exclusive influence in this, for this matter, can be very easily explained as, you know, countries losing ability to take independent policy decisions. So they know what's best for their regimes, they know what's best for their countries and national interests, but they cannot act upon those, and they only can do what Russia wants them to do. It's a Belarus kind of model, is a fait accompli of sphere of exclusive influence. And Russia has been using this wide range of non-military instruments of power in this country for the last decades and last decade or so very effectively, and now we're in this point in time when it really doesn't matter what Georgian Dream wants or what Georgia's national interests are. They don't care about what Georgian people want. What matters is that there is something that Russia, Kremlin wants to accomplish here, and they find ways how to do that. They set the objectives, and then they choose very carefully what is the right tool for achieving that particular objective. So now, because they see that the main problem in this country for them, from Russian perspective, is the public opinion, which is strongly pro-Western, pro-European, pro-NATO, pro-American, then what is the best tool to influence public opinion? You cannot influence public opinion through occupation. You can hold the land through occupation, but if you want to change how people think and act, then information is the key tool for you. And they master these patterns, starting from active measures up until now. And that's what's happened.
Georgia is one of the test grounds, I would assume. Gustaf, let's come to you now from a broader perspective, particularly about hindering or ensuring that the authoritarians are not ahead of the democracies in this battle. Do you think the West is doing enough to tackle this issue? And if you don't, what would you like to see?
Well, thank you, and thanks also for the invitation to be here in lovely Tbilisi, and also a special thanks to Nino Evgenidze, not only for hosting us and having us here, but also for handing out sun lotion to a Swede before this panel. Very much appreciated from my point of view. This is a brilliant panel, and I think that we've heard some very interesting things. And the answer to your question, Ia, is that of course we don't understand. Or maybe we do understand, but we're not doing too much. We had a brilliant panel on China here before, and I recall some of us were at the Lennart Merieux conference in 2019, when then Defense Minister Ursula von der Leyen of Germany was in a panel with the President of Georgia, and then Defense Minister von der Leyen said that she thought it would be very good for the European Union to have a China policy or a China strategy. And fast forward 5 years, she has been Commission President. We belong to the same European party, so I really like her. It's not her fault, but we still don't really know how to deal with China, for example, and the authoritarianism that comes from China, also from a European Union perspective. So we're not really there, and from a Swedish perspective also. Last summer, in 2023, we had a very peculiar situation in Sweden because all of a sudden, out of nowhere, there were a lot of people showing up burning the Holy Quran. And I mean, you can believe in coincidences sometimes, but in the midst of the discussions we had with Turkey about allowing us into NATO, all of a sudden, secret people who no one had ever heard of showed up outside the Turkish embassy in Stockholm and burning the Holy Quran. And that is not really a coincidence. And that made also the reaction from the Swedish society to allude to a discussion about cultural wars, about Islam in general, about Western culture, about whether or not we should infringe on our rights because we want to have the national security instead. And that is also a discussion that played in the hands to a man in the Kremlin. So we can see this also, but we're not really prepared to do it. In Sweden, I would say that when it comes to disinformation or cyber attacks or hybrid attacks and hacking and trying to get some compromise of politicians, we are rather well prepared. And also the Swedish military, for example, as Sweden is a NATO ally, is well prepared. But as was mentioned in the NATO panel also before, that when we joined NATO finally some months ago, it was very important for us to stress also in the political debate when we were talking about the civil aspects of everything, that it's not the Swedish armed forces joining NATO. It's Sweden as a country joining NATO. And that really brings up something else. I mean, are we as a society, with kids going to school, getting their only news from TikTok? Are they really there and being prepared for the things and the current developments around our local areas and our neighborhoods? Is the Swedish hospital system prepared for being member of NATO? Is the Swedish public broadcaster prepared for being a member of NATO as well? And that is really where we need to focus now, because we have the military thing really sorted out, but when it comes to the threats from authoritarian leadership, from dictators attacking the fundamentals of the society. We are not that prepared as we must, unfortunately, but we're getting there.
I think Scott's going to give us some responses or some answers how to prepare ourselves for that, right? So from the technological development, AI perspective, what do you think we should be doing better, and what do you think we're doing wrong in this regard?
Well, thank you. And before I get into the answer, I just wanted to thank Yuya. I also want to thank David Kramer and Nino for the invitation. This is my first time to visit Georgia, and it's just been a spectacular opportunity to be here. I also want to thank you for the sun. It's so warm and pleasant, and for the opportunity to get the suntan that I'm earning. I am earning right now.
So did you decide to stay in Georgia, or are you leaving?
I wish I could stay.
Okay.
I wish I could stay. I will be back.
Okay.
So the question's a good one. Our societies have been struggling with misinformation and disinformation since democracies were started in our respective countries. The challenge, of course, has been that the internet has vastly expanded the surfaces for us to consume information of any sort, and our established media has been disintermediated by other perspectives and other views, and various organizations that, you know, they're expert bloggers who are taking time and eyeballs away from straightforward news reporting, and that's all to the good. More information, more perspectives are okay. But the fact is that as the internet has exploded, it has meant that there are new surfaces in which actors who are very much interested in purveying false information, misleading information, are out there. And since I began at Google 13 years ago, this has been a focus. In the initial stages, it was based on the concept that ISIS was using the internet to radicalize people in Arab-speaking communities where there was very little in the way of content that could actually be surfaced that would contest the narratives that ISIS and others were presenting. So we learned a lot from those sorts of campaigns, and then, of course, the whole debates around 2016 and what happened in our elections. I happen to be on the board of the America for Bulgaria Foundation, and I learned that Bulgaria is like a testing bed, a test bed for a lot of tactics that are used there, and we were studying those tactics. So today, we have this thing you may have heard of called AI. AI. Generative AI, large language models. And the fact is that large language models are able to produce information at scale very quickly. It's not that great for the most part, but it is powerful. And this is also the concept of deep fakes that I'm sure you've heard about as well, where you take a bit of video or you take some pictures and then you're able to create entirely new videos out of whole cloth or out of whole digits, and able to present them as something true, or at least create confusion around that information. And then the final version of that is related to audio, where you take a snippet of a person's voice and you're able to use it to create an entirely fake video of a phone, audio of a phone call or whatever. It's the last one that I'm actually most concerned about right now. I think there are a number of companies in the private sector that are having the ability to determine when something is a deep fake. I am not vouching for any of them, but it seems to me that this is an area where there's going to be an explosion of question about all of the information that we're receiving, and there should be. We as consumers need to be on guard against misleading misinformation. Please don't rely on the companies to fix this, or don't rely on your governments to tell you what is true and what is not true. So we as individuals have to be made more resilient to this, and I do think technology can also be helpful with that, so maybe we can come
So
back to that.
to stay on the AI topic very
Yeah.
briefly before we move on to different topics. So you're saying that it's very dangerous, basically. The way the authoritarians can use AI is dangerous. So what is, in addition to the companies and the potential algorithms that would detect the fake, what else are large companies like Google is doing to prevent this?
So a lot of what we're doing is on our surfaces where we do have a lot of video, so YouTube, where we're really thinking very deeply about how to get at this issue. So, and there's some promising work there. But it's that Vimeo or like some other video that's surfacing on a blog site somewhere that all of a sudden gets blown up, where society just has to be ready for something like that. So one of the things that we have been doing for a long time that we're really investing much more in is campaigns around creating and enhancing resilience. So focusing on the tactics that are most used in these types of campaigns, the emotional manipulation that people use, the creating whataboutism contexts, other means of manipulation, and trying at scale to surface those types of tools and tactics to our audiences, and also to do them with partners more locally. Jigsaw just finished a pre-bunking campaign in Ukraine, which was done with local influencers and local organizations on the ground, which managed to reach 79% of the population between 18 and 55. And it was had very positive results. And I think this is something that we can also scale. The more you sensitize the public, the more skeptical they are, the more likely they are to at least ask one or two questions before sharing the thing.
Mm-hmm. That's public education and access,
Essentially,
basically.
yes.
So Steve, I would like to come to you now, as we're talking about the access to information. You touched upon Russia briefly. You're very, of course, RFE is very influential and impactful in Ukraine, everything Ukraine war related, and other regions as well, of course. I'm curious about the Georgia part of it. As we all know, the foreign agent transparency law, which is frequently called the Russian law, not only Georgia, but pretty much everywhere, has been enacted. And RFE is funded from the outside sources. So what's RFE's position on registering as a foreign agent, and how do you think it's going to impact, the law is going to impact your operations here?
Well, we did not register, and we've taken the opinion and we've been advised that we do not believe that this law applies to us. Okay. That's not to say, though, that we're not concerned about it, and we're concerned not just for journalistic entities, but on all organizations that are threatened by this. We heard some talk yesterday about organizations deciding to register because they couldn't handle the fines that could potentially come from this. And I think that's a chilling effect. The work that's being done is not being done by any of these entities. It's not being done on behalf of a foreign power. It's being done on behalf of the people of Georgia. Right. And that's why it's viewed as a threat. That's why there's such political pressure right now to try to keep this isolated, keep these opinions to yourself. Mm-hmm. And it's dangerous. And we see it, you know, our organization, I told you where we operate, every month there's another effort somewhere to declare us an extremist organization, an undesirable organization, foreign agents, and there's a proliferation of a playbook that looks awfully similar to one that came out of Russia. And Belarus is going to extraordinary lengths these days to attempt to silence people. So there's undoubtedly an effort underway, and we're going to have to continue to stay agile and smart about how we approach it. I want to say two things. You mentioned Ukraine. Number one, we have more than 150 journalists who are on the ground in Ukraine right now. Many of them are proud Ukrainians, and I'm enormously proud of their efforts, really going back 10 years now, but especially over the last couple of years since the invasion. Our people are basically showing the world what's taking place inside Ukraine, and they're doing it with unbelievable professionalism. They're paying a very high price. It's dangerous work, but they're also doing incredibly great investigative work. You know, Scott talked about some of the technologies that's out there. We like the combination, the partnership of technology and good old-fashioned reporting, because as a result of that, we can spot early on these disinformation campaigns. Tools exist to help us spot them, but then the journalists have to go out and do their jobs. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on there. Our Ukrainian journalists are among the best investigative journalists I've ever worked with, and I'm proud of them today and every day.
Thank you. Thank you. Shota, I want to put you on the spot here now and ask you about some of the operations that you described in your opening remarks. Are those operations working? And if you could look at it from the perspective of what Steve just talked about, which is unbiased, factual, true, just, comprehensive reporting that we all expect to see from journalists. Where do you think Georgia stands from that perspective? And if you would include the investigative journalism in Georgia and how it can help with disinformation, that would be great as well.
Right. So first of all, if it's working or not, we can judge by a simple criteria. 10 years ago in this country, mentioning that somebody is a pro-Russian political actor or a civil society or a stakeholder or an individual just having pro-Russian sentiments, it was an absolutely outrageous political suicide and unbelievable thing to confess in public, you know. Now we see that we have a government in place which is the direct extension of the Russian regime, and it aligns its narratives completely and fully with those of Kremlin. So whatever mainstream anti-Western and pro-Russian narratives are prepared for this part of the world in the offices in Kremlin and other special services, we hear it out loud from the political leadership of this country. This is basically a tragedy for Georgia, but it also speaks a lot to how effectively we all together, internal and external stakeholders, were able to deal with and cope with and counter those hybrid warfare patterns that we were looking at in the broad daylight, you know, and we were reading the reports, we were reading the articles, we were aware of what Russia was doing here, but Russia was always managing somehow to extend influences not only in Georgia, but in the wider region too. But of course, this achievement of Russia is not complete, because we do have a very vibrant civil society here in this country, and the public opinion still somehow maintains very, very high support towards the Western policy. But you see, the effectiveness of propaganda can be measured even in that the people strongly support this, but because the whole information ecosystem is so polarized and the water is so muddy that it's impossible to basically stand for something very firmly, because people are confused. Some of them still believe that there might be a chance, you know, of Western integration no matter what. We're moving forward somehow. Some people see that at this point in time it is irrelevant anymore to speak about Western integration because we're moving the other way, but they don't know what to do. They can go out in the streets, they can protest for a day, two, for a week, but then, you know, it has to be structured in a better way to influence the policy. But the policy is influenced by another stakeholder and the actor. So this, from the societal resilience part, I would say we're very strong. We can even be a very good example of how this society is coping with this massive information warfare from the foreign and their own governments, you know, combined and reinforcing one another's efforts and messages. But on the other hand, how we were able to influence the policies so far is very marginal. And we have seen this country, the most pro-Western country, once again, you know, in the world, I would say, has turned into a stakeholder which has a special strategic partnership agreement with China on one hand. The leadership of this country is going to Tehran on regular basis to attend some sort of, you know, activities there. And we see this alignment on the micro level already, you know, in policy and narrative with the Russian Federation. So I would say there is a lot to learn for us how to make this knowledge that we have operational and how to put it into effective effect and how to bring to the wider public here this understanding that, okay, we all know that West is a friend, Russia is an enemy, and so what do we do about it now?
Let me turn to you now, Gustaf. So we need to learn from what we're seeing and adjust to it, you know, use technology to some extent to counter some of the malign processes by authoritarians. From the European perspective, how do you see that possible? Whose responsibility is? And Scott said that it's not the government, it's not the big tech, it's really the individuals. But is that possible to have from the individual level to resist something as organized as, you know, state-sponsored disinformation, for example? And what's the European perspective on this? What do you see from your vantage point?
I think it was Aristotle who said, I've studied 2 weeks of philosophy at university. Aristotle said that everybody's responsibility is no one's responsibility. And the problem is that this is everybody's responsibility. It is the government's responsibility, but it's also the individual responsibility. I've met, I'm a member of parliament from Gothenburg. You're all invited there if you want to come and visit. I went to school for a study visit in a school in my constituency, and I met 12-year-olds talking about the importance of denazifying Ukraine because they've seen this on TikTok. And it's not the platform. Yeah. It could be the platform. It is the platform in some senses. But it's also that they are now getting their information without any filter from parents, without any discussion in school about being very aware of the sources. And they really believe this. And I know that the Swedish public broadcaster, SVT, they refuse for security reasons to use TikTok. But they have one exception, and that is they have a TikTok account aimed at kids from the age of 8 to 12, because they know that that's the only way they can reach them. And I think this is true. I don't like it, but I think this is true. So of course, it's everybody's responsibility, but especially also from also the government side. On the other hand, also, I think that what was brought up by Steve is that in this new way of dealing with technology also, it's not that only that we have more consumers of media and news and information, but also, and this is no news for anybody, everybody with a phone is a journalist. And what we see now in Belarus, that is that they are jailing people not for being journalists or for writing or for posting, but just for liking things on social media. People are being jailed right now. There was a guy in Arkhangelsk in Russia who was jailed because he was caught watching an anti-Putin video on his bus to school. So that is also something new which we really need to talk about. I have made a promise to some friends I talked with during lunch earlier that I will speak more about Georgia, Belarus, and Ukraine than I speak of Sweden the coming months, because that is the most important thing we can do right now, to keep it on the agenda, to talk about it, so the people get mad about it, how much we talk about keeping the situation, what we see now in this particular country, when it comes to the risks of demise into something else in October, but to keep this very high. From a European Union perspective, and I'm not an expert, despite my very young looks, I'm a very old man on the inside, so I'm not really sure about the discussion about legislation to regulate AI. I mean, that is something that has been discussed in all countries for years. But that is one thing that is making me sick and tired. The discussion about the discussion it's like the discussion about fatigue in Ukraine. There's no fatigue in support Ukraine. There's a fatigue in the discussion about fatigue, because we have these very abstract philosophical discussions that really leads nowhere forward. So I think that we really need to make a decision from a European Union perspective. What do we want to do? Not talk about what we would like to do, but what do we really want to, and get on working with it. We have a momentum now with the new Commission coming in, with the new European Parliament just being elected, and with an autumn ahead of us, which of course will be extremely focused on these things, with elections in Moldova, in this country, in the US, and so forth. So now is the momentum. It's just about getting the work done.
I wonder what Scott is thinking right now. Regulating big tech is a big issue in the U.S.
Look,
I think the EU is a bit ahead of the United States at the moment, and Google is
obviously
part of
a global company, and so the regulations that the EU has presented, like going back to GDPR, have been honestly very welcome, because if there's so many countries out there who all have a different perspective, and the EU has taken leadership in that space, and they've become an innovator in that space. And so you see many US states adopting GDPR, et cetera. But what I was going to say is that this is a whole society thing. And it's not as if the tech companies want to be on the wrong side of history. I mean, they want to collaborate with democracies on strengthening democracies. But to the point about the ways in which we are socialized today and the ways that I was socialized, like completely different. And so we're still grappling with the enormous change that has taken place. But we have to do that as a society. One of the things that I also wanted to stress here is that we are open societies. And more ideas are better. Being able to share your views, being able to get them out there. But in a place like Russia right now, they recognize that a platform like YouTube is ultimately a major threat to them, because that's the way much of the information about what's actually happening is getting into the country, and they don't like it. And they want to not only shut YouTube down, but they want to make it impossible for the open internet to connect to Russia. Not in the same way China has done. They want to do it differently, which will actually be more problematic for we as democracies around the world, because that technology might be exportable. Mm-hmm. So I think our team is like working really hard to understand that problem, to understand what they're trying to do, feeding that into Google. But again, it's something that all of us need to be deeply concerned about.
I would like to open the questions part, but before I do that, just please hold those thoughts. One final question from me to you, Steve. We talked about big tech, talked about TikTok was brought up, YouTube, of course. As a media organization, not only you, but everybody in the media is largely dependent on the social networks. So do you, from your perspective, do you see any danger that in some cases Russia can block content, or it's already blocked, I presume, in Russia, but other countries that are semi-autocracies, therefore limiting your ability to access and provide people with information in those countries?
I think we have a responsibility to be everywhere where the audience is. If somebody wants If somebody's looking at TikTok, we're going to be there. If somebody wants a feature-length documentary on really great investigative work, we need to do that as well. Interesting, one of the biggest initiatives we've got going right now is designed to reach inside of Iran. And the way we're doing it is not with the formal, good evening, here now the news from Radio Free Europe. That will not work these days. And so what we're doing are podcasts, 21 different podcasts a week, doing things like taking a look at women's rights issues inside Iran. And when that programming is very powerful, when it comes from somebody who looks like members of our audience, who speaks the same language, those types of things, programs that look at music, it can be a gateway programming into any number of different topics. We need to create and reinforce our relevance, and using every means possible. Yeah, we'll use YouTube, we'll use Telegram, we'll use all of it, because if that's where the audience is, then we need to meet them there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And wow, lots of hands. Let's take first 3 questions from the front rows. Georgi, Nino, and yes, please.
Hello, Georgi Baramidze. I'm political secretary of the UNM, Mikhail Saakashvili's party. We all know now that what we've been saying all these years, that Gvineria and his team serving Putin's interests is true. And Putin and Russia using Georgia quite a long time already as a kind of laboratory for all kind of nasty methods, disinformation, slander, and so on and so forth. And we know that now...
Georgi, please, we have a lot of hands up. Please ask your question if you would, please.
Yeah, I need to approach what I want to ask you. And now we are in the very important moment when Georgians should decide whether we go toward west or to the Russian swamp. So and we know how this disinformation works and how powerful Russian Kremlin propaganda is working, which is kind of extension of it, that this government is very effectively using it. What West, what European Union, what United States and our friends can do in order to help Georgian society to defeat this big lie at disinformation, having in mind that our NGOs that are fighting this disinformation now being practically abolished. Thank you.
Thank you. Nino, please, please everybody be brief with the
Nino
questions.
Scott, the question is for you. Yes, GDPR is brilliant, but in the US we've also led important initiatives. One of them, this May, 3 legislative acts were passed bipartisan support in the Senate, led by Amy Klobuchar, and they're all focused on the US use of AI to defend democracy in the US and globally. As the representative of the technology community, how responsive do you think these acts are to actual threats that technology companies face? And the second question is, really quickly, diaspora. With Georgia's elections, we're talking about Georgia's elections and disinformation. There is too much focus on disinformation only inside of Georgia, not sufficient focus on disinformation of the diaspora, and that's where the AI-based solutions and players like you have a role to play. Are you planning to aid Georgia?
Okay.
Thank you.
And please, on the side.
Hi, this is Lagalushka with OSF. I'm wondering what lessons we should be drawing from the arrest of Pavel Durov and the Telegram situation in general in terms of content moderation, AI, disinformation, and how it all flew under the radar for so long. Thank you.
Scott, it sounds like you have more questions than anybody else.
Was that your conclusion?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm not the public policy leader at Google. I try to keep up with what all is going on the policy front. What I would say is I don't know the details of the legislation that was passed, But in terms of the spirit of it, it's the right way to go. And I think that the challenge is in the implementation, especially as the technology continues to change and evolve. So there are lots of various efforts out there to have people feed their algorithms that they're using for Gen AI into a common database, which then can be used to test for deepfakes. But it won't ever capture all the ways in which AI is being used by different people in different contexts. So again, I think that the spirit is right. I think we can make some real progress there. But again, it's hardening the public to the fact that these things are going to be out there, and to be aware and to be concerned and to take a deep breath before you do anything with the information you get, especially if it's in a very problematic context. But I do think that I don't know how responsive the legislation and its proposed solutions are to the actual threat. And I would love to, I'll dig into that more. On Pavel Durov's arrest, I think it was shocking. It was something where I still am unclear as to what the goal of the arrest is. I don't have any I don't think we've had time to digest what it will mean for issues related to content moderation, if the implication is that when a government arrests somebody, they'll hold them until you do what it is that you want them, those governments want to do. So I think that there's a lot of confusion around what happened, why it happened, still being disseminated, still being analyzed, but I'm really, really interested in that whole set of conversations and the implications of it, because it's going to have a dramatic impact and chilling effect, I think, in maybe the wrong ways. And it's going to encourage, again, what you do in a democracy then becomes something that the autocrats can do with impunity, because you've done it.
I think there's a danger here that, Telegram, let's just simply shut down Telegram because it has been used in some cases for people to do harm. But there's an awful lot of people who share information that journalists take a look at. We do our own reporting as a result of that. In some cases, we're distributing our programming through Telegram channels. It depends on the region. But I think, as Scott was saying, I think caution is an important word right now. Diaspora.
This is my first trip to Georgia. I don't know a whole lot about the diaspora in the US and Europe and elsewhere, so I don't know. But what I do know is that diaspora communities in general are target-rich environments for disinformation from those who want to convey it, by governments, by China, by others, that they're especially in countries in which those communities are kind of on the margins of society. So as you would expect, where there's grievance, disinformation can help aggravate that grievance, and has been very effective, going back to my initial point about ISIS. That's who they targeted. They targeted diaspora communities that were not well integrated, and tried to convince them that the societies that they were living in, that gave them shelter and freedom, were now the enemies.
But this is why this is exactly where we pick up, because our programming, which is in Georgian or in any number of 27 different languages, is designed to be not only consumed inside the country, but also by the diaspora. We do not target, just so I'm clear, we do not target the United States. That's not that's not our focal point. But it is, yes, it is a place of, it can foster disinformation in those areas, but I also believe that the flip side is true, that important, vital, factual information can be shared with these communities as well, in the native tongue.
Yeah. And Gustaf, I'm going to give you the easy one now. Like, what can the West do to help Georgia?
To help Georgia. Well, that is the question of the hour. I think I was in Chisinau last week, and I listened to President Sandu, and she said that, because, as you know, they have elections as well a week ahead of Georgia. And she said that the more misinformation and the more propaganda from Russia, the better, because people are now in Moldova stopping to believe it, because it's so extreme what they see and what they pump into the country. She said it with some humor, but I thought it was rather interesting, because there's no limit of the stupidity of the propaganda right now in Moldova, which is rather interesting. There's a lot of things we can do, I think, and I don't really see this as a possible reality, but we need to prepare ourselves for it. And that is what will happen if the opposition wins the election, if Gvineria doesn't accept the outcome of the election, and we will see, of course, protests on the streets, as we saw in May and June, and then we will go into a situation which we had in Minsk in August and September of 2020. Mm-hmm. Slowly, slowly, slowly. So that's why it is so extremely important. And that is also the cheapest way and the easiest way of supporting Georgia and the democratic forces in Georgia is to talk. And to make sure that this is high on the agenda when the Foreign Affairs Council is meeting in Brussels, to keep it high on the agenda of Swedish politicians, to really emphasize that what is happening now is not only important for Georgia, it's also important for Europe, which Georgia belongs to and is a part of. That can't be said more than enough. And also that this is really to say this or nothing. I mean, this is really it for Georgia this coming election, and to really keep on talking about it. Mm-hmm. And that is also something. That is also one thing that politicians tend to be rather good at. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Please.
And very quickly, to emphasize that point, international election observers.
Yes.
International election observers, to have as many here as possible during those elections. I hope to be one of them.
Good. Shota, do you have a comment?
That's what exactly I wanted to emphasize here. The elections are around the corner, and we have an experience with previous elections when very well-intended observer missions were equipped with 20th century tools to try to counter the 21st century digital authoritarianism. And I think that's a bigger problem. It's a bigger problem than only Georgia, you know, and this election manipulation is happening in an absolutely different way now than it used to happen before the internet time. And these missions, most of those missions are not prepared to identify, document, and react to those manipulation patterns that are enabled now through the new information environment and through the cyberspace, in and through the cyberspace. So we know for absolute certainty that there's 300,000 civil servants that work in the budgetary institutions in this country, what we call it, you know, administrative resource. They are one way or another harassed to go and vote for the ruling party. And we have seen this in the reports, including in the OSCE report, which was quoted by the United States Embassy in Tbilisi, that what we saw in the previous parliamentary elections was blurring the boundaries between the ruling party and the state. And then, all in all, the observer report was saying that yes, there were shortcomings, there were problems, but you know, these elections were not perfect, but we somehow still legitimized the elections with a lot of problems. And here I come to the core of this problem, because there were thousands of evidence collected by the investigative journalists, which you mentioned before. There were thousands of evidence collected by the local civil society organizations. And because they were disregarded and dismissed altogether by the Central Election Committee, which is again the extension of the ruling party, or the courts, which is again the extension of the ruling party, you know, we ended up with the situation when it was quacking like a duck, it looked like a duck, but actually we were still looking for some more evidence, you know, to say that, yeah, basically it was a duck. So in this particular situation, I think that in general, the main problem of contemporary information environment is to find, you know, the blurred boundaries between the truth and the false. And what we know for sure, we have to be able to stand for it.
Mm-hmm. And that's where the West can help.
Right.
I saw more hands in the back. So we have 2 minutes, literally, before we need to stop. So let's take quick 3 questions in the front, in the back, and on the side here, Georgi. Oh, you have the mic. I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead, please.
I just want to thank Shota for mentioning Georgia as an example of the success of Russian hybrid warfare. And to add a little bit of salt on that, the Georgian government's Strategic Communications Department, an institution established with Western money to counter Russian disinformation. A last year report by Meta, the Facebook parent company, said that institution coordinates dissemination of Russian disinformation. So Western taxpayer money funded Russian disinformation in Georgia, and some of this cooperation continued even after publication of Meta investigation.
Thank you, Georgi. We had a question up front here.
Yeah,
sorry.
Nate Ostler from Kiev Independent. I wanted to ask about you mentioned that children were hearing about this Ukrainian Nazis narrative. How do you go about addressing this without amplifying we find this problem all the time at work. We have this issue, we want to debunk it, but we also don't want to keep talking about it so that then it reaches more people. How do you kind of square this circle?
That's a steep question, I guess. Please.
And that's an age-old problem, and you're 100% right to keep it in mind while trying to do it. I think it's very difficult, though, to say, the extreme would be to say, well, just ignore it because we know it's not true. But then how do you, if you agree that that's dangerous, then how do you do it without recommitting the foul? And you can perhaps talk about the long, proud heritage, inclusive heritage inside Ukraine and things like that. But there is no simple answer on how to handle that without compounding the original problem.
Mm-hmm. Quickly.
Hello, Anita Ntadze, non-resident fellow of the German Marshall Fund. First of all, thank you for being with us, and thank you, moderator, for encouraging this discussion, which is very important personally for me because I'm doing my research about Russian information warfare in the occupied territories of Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova. And this is very important, just briefly I will mention that if we want to talk... Very important question. While the disinformation can be in the domestic originated, but also state influence, it is obvious in the research that our defense measure was not enough efficient to mitigate the disinformation. And do you think it is the time to implement more offensive measures?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think that summarizes, I had a closing question in mind, and I think it's going to dovetail with that very nicely. Basically, who's winning and what do we need to do to win? So let's start from you, Scott.
I think that my money is on democracies and Democrats who are able to move fast, think clearly, have resilience in their societies. That's where I am most confident. I know that authoritarians have a lot of influence within our societies, but I do believe that a free press, complemented with robust education for the population, with the collaboration of big tech companies that are aligned fundamentally with democracies, that we're going to win.
Mm-hmm. Shota, let's come to you.
Well, basically, we're in front of this really decisive battle. Maybe we have said this earlier too much, but now it's really about, the actual orientation of this country. On one side, we have Belarusia, which is a fait accompli, and it's a point of non-return after this election. So there will be no way of leveraging, this government into changing the policies anytime soon. And on the other hand, we have this very difficult situation with the state capture that was mentioned from the stage many times, and very complex and muddied information environment where it's impossible for the people to judge clearly, even in this, given this very hard evidence that we have in front of us. So this battle is not only about Georgia. It is connected with Ukraine. It is connected with the bigger geopolitical environment. So I really do hope that the observer missions will be ready for the monitoring of these elections, and then the things that will happen during and after these elections will basically make sure that the choice of the Georgian people will be duly reflected in the final outcomes of this decisive election.
Gustaf.
I wanted to answer the question to me about the young people on social media. I mean, when I was at that school and I heard that these kids was talking about the importance of the denazification of Ukraine. Of course, the first thing I had to do was to cancel all the meetings for the rest of the day and to have an offline discussion with them. Mm-hmm. Because I don't think that the Russian propaganda which is aimed at Sweden, nobody in Sweden believes it, because it has this old Brezhnev narrative that no one in Sweden really cares about. They're good in hybrid operations. They're good in, I mentioned the burning of the Holy Quran, for example, but in the pure propaganda is aimed at those who just don't have any filters to it, which are the young. And I think that you shouldn't reproduce the narrative online. You should have an offline discussion with them. And it will take time, and you will get mad, but that is the only way you can deal with this in a Swedish perspective.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. And since I'm partial to RFE, you have the closing word, and please.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the moderation today, and thanks for all the questions. Very quickly, your question was who's winning? The game's not over. A gathering like this, in future times, if things don't go the right way, this will be an illegal gathering. Yes. And we can't allow Georgia, a wonderful place that has treasured its freedoms for so long, to fall into that situation. It has happened elsewhere, but the reason I remain optimistic is I believe it is impossible to simply silence every voice of opposition, every dissenting viewpoint, every member of the free press, and also at the core of it is people who long to be free, and those cherished freedoms are not going to be taken away lightly. There's a huge opportunity here in this country on October 26th to help determine which way this goes. And I think there's a lot of hard work that's going to have to be done between now and then, and we'll be on the absolutely watching with great interest.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. Please thank the panelists for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you very much, panel. Iya, thank you for a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you also to this panel for not passing out.